Good evening, everyone. It's great to see you all here this evening. My name's John Dewar. I'm the Vice-Chancellor of Trobe University, and it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you to this, the third of our Bold Thinking events for this year. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet tonight and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. The topic for tonight's event is alcohol and family violence. Where to from here? As I'm sure most of you know, about 6 weeks ago, the findings of the Royal Commission into Family Violence were released, and with them came a raft of recommendations that we hope will bring an end to what is a devastating but all too often crime. Tonight, we're joined by a wonderful panel of experts who will explore why family violence is so prevalent in our society, and in particular what role alcohol plays in contributing to its prevalence. And crucially, we'll hear about what can be done to end alcohol-related and family violence. Now, part of the purpose of the Bold Thinking series is to bring La Trobe research to a broader public. And the connection between tonight's topic and La Trobe University is that we have two very significant research centres who work in this field. The first is the Judith Lumley Centre for Mother, Infant and Family Health Research, and the second is the Centre for Alcohol Policy and Research, which in turn is funded by the Foundation for Alcohol Research and Education, or FARE. So from La Trobe tonight, we have Professor Angela Taft, who's the director of the Judith Lumley Centre, and the centre undertakes and interprets research to address issues of major public health importance, particularly for mothers, parents and their infants. Its focus includes improving the health system's response to partner violence and investigating alcohol-related partner violence, contraception and the prevention of unwanted pregnancies. Dr. Anne-Marie Laslett is a Public Health Research Fellow at the Centre for Alcohol Policy Research at La Trobe, and she's also on the panel tonight. CAPER examines alcohol-related harms and the effectiveness of alcohol-related policies. And Anne-Marie has conducted extensive research into the impact of alcohol on families. Joining our two La Trobe researchers tonight, I'm delighted to welcome the Deputy Commissioner of Victoria Police, Wendy Steendam. Wendy has been a member of Victoria Police for more than 30 years and has been instrumental in the Victoria Police Violence Against Women and Children strategy since its inception in 2001. And finally, we are pleased to welcome, or I should say welcome back to La Trobe, she's a regular visitor, has become one, to Melbourne-based writer and feminist Clementine Ford, who, as I'm sure you know, writes across a number of popular media platforms and is a regular guest on the project. Clementine says that her number one mission is to speak openly and honestly about the state of the world as we live in it, and she hopes to give other women the language and confidence to articulate their own feelings. Please join me in welcoming tonight's panel. I'm now going to hand over to tonight's host, radio personality and former current affairs journalist Francis Leach, for what promises to be a captivating discussion on one of the most important issues our society faces today. Over to you, Francis.
Thanks, John. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming along, and also to those who are watching this stream via the website and might want to participate by using the hashtag BoldLTU at some stage when we do get to questions. There will be an hour of conversation and then an opportunity for you in the audience and out there via the stream listening in and watching to pose your questions to our panel to help further the discussion. I'd like to start with Angela, and I think it's important that we define our terms here. When we talk about family violence, what do we actually mean? Because it's not just physical violence, is it?
No, family violence is the harm that one member of a family can impose on another, and it can be either physical abuse or sexual abuse. It can be financial control. It can be spiritual abuse. It can be harassment in the form of, texting or phoning or hanging around outside somebody's work, all of those things, I have to say that family violence includes, the most common form is intimate partner violence, so violence by your closest, your partner, and child abuse. So it includes child abuse, it includes parent-to-child abuse, it also includes child-to-parent abuse. It includes all the diversity of families that we have in Victoria. We're blessed to have a wide range of types of families, so it can be same-sex families, blended families, families from migrant refugee backgrounds, so it incorporates everything, adopted families, in-laws, whoever.
Wendy, as someone on the front line or policing incidents of family violence in all its myriad of forms as described by Angela, how difficult is it then to be able to identify and deal with there and then as police make those visits?
So it's probably important to give some context to the number of incidents that we attend as an organisation, and that's only the tip of the iceberg. So up until December 2015, calendar year, we attended over 74,000 incidents of family violence. So that's 203 incidents a day, 8 incidents per hour, and 1 incident every 7 minutes that our members are actually attending.
Why is that not considered an emergency? Because it is, on those numbers.
Well, I think it is, and the Royal Commission and the focus of that was part of the reason, because this is such a significant issue for our community, and the things that we're responding and attending to. And we know there's under-reporting rates. By the time people come and report to us, it's often been occurring in their life for many, many years.
The prevalence of alcohol, Wendy, what are your members telling you about how often when they attend these incidents, as you said, at such huge numbers, that alcohol or other substances, people being affected by substances, are prevalent in those moments?
So we know that in many circumstances, alcohol and drug misuse is a present factor. So our data that we have from when we attend incidents over the years talks about, particularly for perpetrators of family violence, around 35%. That makes up of possible alcohol present and definitely alcohol present. And that's been a consistent or a stable sort of statistic over the last number of years, and it's not diminishing.
So we can't argue it away, we can't explain it away, we can't pretend it's not happening. And Anne-Marie, you wrote recently that you believe that as many as 3/4 of Australians have at some point in the last 12 months felt that they've been negatively affected in one way or another by somebody under the influence of alcohol or maybe some other substances.
Yeah, there are a range of harms that people have affected by, that people are affected by. So alcohol can cause or can be involved with people littering or making noise, so there can be amenity types of harms, but there can also be more serious harms that include family violence and child abuse and neglect, where alcohol can make the situation worse, or a proportion of those cases seem to be associated with alcohol.
It's such a big issue, and as we've seen, we sort of painted a picture there of just how pervasive it is in the community. Angela, why has it taken till now for this conversation to really start about it?
Well, ironically, the conversation started round about the end of the 18th century, because the Women's Christian, not many people know this, and the reason I know this is my colleague who's done also some fabulous work in her doctoral research, Ingrid Wilson, whose work I'll be referring to later, but the Women's Christian Temperance movement actually started to campaign against alcohol because they were horrified by the amount of abuse and harm coming to women and children. So it started then in our own country. Louisa Lawson, Henry Lawson's mother, campaigned to try and make refuge and safety for women and children because her own daughter-in-law was being abused by her son. But not only that, she was campaigning in the 1800s, but it was easier because it became caught up with suffrage for the women's temperance movement to be called moralising wowsers, and therefore the alcohol got lost. In Louisa Lawson's case, it didn't get lost, but it was taken over by other things. So it's been around, but it wasn't really until the women's movement picked the issue of domestic violence up, and the rape crisis centres also, in order to try and enhance the safety of women and children. And so it needed legal reform, it needed refuges, it needed people to support those women. And so the focus was really on the crisis end. And alcohol has gotten lost. I mean, I think there are other things. I don't think that in terms of alcohol research there was really very much interest in looking at the kind of private sphere of alcohol-related harms because there was so much happening in the public sphere. At the same time, I think that the women's movement in terms of wanting to make sure that the debate didn't get sidetracked by using alcohol as an excuse, if you like, was one of the reasons on the other side that it's really, it was really a little under. And what we know is that the harms to women and children are more severe when there's drinking, when the man is drinking in particular, or when the couple is drinking. There is no association with when the woman is drinking in terms of a greater likelihood of violence. So I think it's absolutely time.
Are we capable then of having a discussion about the impact of alcohol, Clementine, and its role in family violence without making it an excuse for family violence?
Maybe it's just because I'm feeling cynical today. I sort of waver between feeling optimistic and pessimistic, but I'm not confident that, despite the fact that we've had the Royal Commission, which I think is it was just an incredible thing to happen in Victoria, I still think, from my personal experience, seeing the way that members of the public react to discussions around family violence in general, I'm not confident in this particular moment.
Why not?
Well, because I think that, for a start, there's a lot of whataboutery when discussions about family violence are raised. And when I say whataboutery, I mean that there's a lot of responses that begin with, what about? So you talk about the very real fact that, on average, just over one woman, in terms of numbers, that in almost 50% of those cases of intimate partner homicide, alcohol was a factor. And you can talk about those things, and that's an indisputable fact. But the response from so many people is still, well, what about the men who are victimised by violence? Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that men are not victimised by family violence. I think oftentimes the statistics that are willfully interpreted around that fail to acknowledge the fact that those statistics are taken from boys over the age of 15, which means that a lot of it is happening in family situations as well, and is not necessarily a correlation between, if there is a male victim, then there's an equal and opposite perpetrator in terms of gender. But also that if you speak to any person who works either in legal or police services, or anyone who works in women's health services, or even in men's behavioural change services, about the impact of family violence or the impact of intimate partner violence when it is a female perpetrator against a male victim, then it is very clear that the difference in fear is significant, that men do not typically report living in fear of their lives. Women do typically report living in fear of their lives. Men are not murdered in anywhere near the same rate. I mean, it's not even comparable. And so the fact that you can actually lay out these very clearly researched facts and very, very clearly demonstrated data around how violence impacts on families and single people. And for me personally tonight, I think that the issue of family violence is incredibly important, but I also think that the issue of just male violence against women is equally important to this conversation, and the lessons that, the ways in which young boys might be being conditioned to behave in a certain way outside of families is relevant as well to the discussion of alcohol.
So it's part of a big picture in terms of that issue about violence against women. And
But so just quickly to finish that, if you can't even have a clear conversation about that without having to acknowledge all of these what about questions and have those discussions completely derailed by irrelevant and meaningless data, then how can you actually progress that conversation to discuss the real impact of alcohol, particularly when alcohol is in Australia is so intrinsically linked with this idea of socialising, and it's very heavily enmeshed in our idea of the national consciousness, you know, that we go out and we have a beer and a barbecue, and that's
I
what
want
we
to talk
do.
to you about that notions of masculinity and alcohol.
I really want to respond, yes, because I think if we know that alcohol's involved in so much of violence, if we know it increases the severity of harm that women and children experience, if we know, and I know from the work that Ingrid has done, that women are in much more fear when he's pissed and in their faces, why wouldn't we want to do something about it? I consider myself...
I agree.
That the bottom line is the safety of women and children, or the safety of people in families. And if we can do something about it at every single level, if we can find out ways to reduce and prevent the harm that comes to women and children by reducing something to do with alcohol, whether it's at the social level, the community level, or the individual level, or the relationship level, why wouldn't you do it?
I want to talk to Wendy about this, because when we spoke in our pre-interview, Wendy, you mentioned one phrase that really jumped out at me, and it was in relation to family violence, and you said that in all the incidents that your members report, power and control are the things that they notice most about, whatever relationship it is and at whatever state of distress it's in. Can you explain a bit about that?
So I think, and we need to be really clear about this, the prime, I suppose, factor of family violence is about power and control over an individual. Alcohol and presence of alcohol is an exacerbating factor, but the fundamental cause is, behaviour is about power and control, and we can't, I suppose, look past that. We need to understand that. There are many people that drink alcohol that do not abuse, and equally there are many people that have many other issues such as drug abuse, mental health issues that also don't abuse people. So it's people that have power and control issues that actually have behavioural issues that lead to family violence, that is the prime issue, and then when they drink, that exacerbates some of their behaviour. And the prime, I suppose, driver of the behaviour of family violence, given its power and control, is about gender inequality. And that's why we also need to be focusing on that issue. And I agree, it's important to look at the exacerbating factors, look at how we can assist around those issues, but we can't lose sight of the fact that we also need to be working and thinking about gender equality and the drivers of that in the context of this particular issue.
And we're going to talk more about the cultural aspect of alcohol and its links to notions of masculinity, particularly in the Australian context, where it seems to be more heightened than many other cultures. But in your research, generally the attitude towards alcohol and its harmful effects, not just on the body itself for those who consume it, but, you know, the harm that it causes in situations like this, are we able to have that conversation with the casual drinker about that, or is it still taboo?
That alcohol might be affecting their behaviour?
Yeah, their judgment, and therefore, you know, will they accept, for instance, the undeniable causal link to the outrageous level of family violence?
I mean, I don't know that there's an undeniable causal link either. I mean, I tend to agree that it is about power and control, and it's about how you've been brought up. It's about whether you're exposed as a child to domestic violence. It's about how you're expected to behave in situations, what your social norms are, what your cultural norms are, what do you do when someone confronts you, how do you respond, can you manage your emotions? There's a whole range of things I think that come into play. So, I do think that alcohol doesn't assist us to have a relation, to in these relationships, particularly when we're drinking heavily, and particularly, you know, when we're parenting in a whole range of different ways. So
because you did make an interesting comment to me too. You did point out that to drink is also a choice. It's not a condition. It can become a condition if you're an alcoholic, but it's not a condition the way that someone might be born with a genetic disorder.
Well, to drink is a choice, and to be violent is also a choice.
Yes, so people are making choices, so we have to hold them accountable in that sense. And it's that fine balance that you talk about, Angela, about not making excuses, but trying to understand, and that fine balance between responsibility and cause. It's a difficult argument to make in that sense, isn't it?
I don't think there's a difficult argument to make. I think my interest really is in what can we do to assist that to be the safe and the less harmful choice, and who else in the community or the surrounding environments You know, we did a fantastic job in Australia that kids, my kids, you know, if they were going out partying and they were going out drinking, finally there was somebody that they would choose to do to keep them safe. You know, can we do the same with if the guys go out to a sporting club and, you know, we all know we're going to get plastered or whoever, and somebody then says, now hang on a minute, either I'm in a guardian role or, you know, you're my best mate, I actually really like your girlfriend at home. I don't think you're safe to go home. I'm going to say something and do something. My interest is what can we do to change it, to change the story and to change that culture. I mean, I think we've got a whole issue in Australia about changing the culture of drinking altogether and the idea of going out to get blind, which is far too common. But I think we have work to do in terms of the where to next, in what can we do to actually help groups of people, particularly when they're young, because both binge drinking and family violence or partner violence, which is a very common form, start in the 18 to 20, you know, in the younger age group. So we, you know, let's start young and see what we can do.
That gets to the heart of what you were saying before, Clementine, about the culture of drinking, its intrinsic relationship with notions of masculinity. And how, despite all of the education campaigns, and I would like to think a growing awareness amongst a certain cohort of men that there is an issue, that there's something fundamentally hard to shift in the Australian male psyche, that being able to hold your drink and when you do behave however you want is still very much part of what it means to be a man.
And also the kinds of things that you drink. You know, you in Australia, if you're a bloke, you don't drink girly drinks. You know, and I'm saying that to be sarcastic, but even the fact that it goes to that deeper level, that, I mean, to me, I think that Australia's cultural mythology is very much built on the idea of masculinity and mateship. And there's a big problem, as I see it, in where women fit into that. And the fact that I don't see that women fit into that. And therefore it's about the way that males communicate with each other and this kind of presence that men and masculinity takes up in terms of what Australia is supposed to be, coupled with these very strict ideas of, you know, a blokiness and blokeisms, and a bloke who loves his sport, and all of these ways that maybe men in Australia and the limits of masculinity that are placed on men in Australia limit them from being able to engage with each other emotionally. So these other things are used as kind of bridges to do that. You know, I was reading some research today about, separate to this completely, but how research in America has shown that a lot of fathers will unconsciously not only prefer having sons, but it makes for a more successful marriage if their firstborn child is a son, because that's someone that they can relate to and have, this is what the research suggested, someone that they can relate to and have an emotional connection to in a way that they are enabled by society to understand. And one of the things that came out of that research was that men often find it easier to bond with each other over a third party or a third object. And I think in Australia that's particularly true over the way that men bond with each other over sports, over the way that some men bond with each other over the abuse of women, and how they bond with each other over the use of alcohol. And sometimes those three things converge and actually create terrible situations for particularly for the women involved. And I think that kind of goes back to what you're saying about the temperance movement and why there's so much opposition to that, because that movement was run by women, and I don't think that, particularly at the end of the 18th century, and even so now, there's not a lot of...
I should say the 19th century.
The 19th
talking about
century.
the late 1800s, yes.
Yeah, sorry.
No,
I slipped as well. That there's not a lot of respect for groups of women trying to organise social change anyway, but particularly when that is perceived to be an attack on men's domain. You know, the fact that in Australia, I think that the idea of the 6 o'clock swill is obscene, but the fact that in Australia women weren't even allowed to drink in pubs, that this was, you know, drinking in Australia is a man's domain still in that consciousness. We've had a lot of success with drink driving strategies and advertisements around drink driving, but I was just thinking before when you were talking that when I think about the ads that are presented, there's still very much, it's still men in the pub together. It's not often portrayed as being something that is a problem for women, even though I think that alcoholism is definitely a problem for women. But the idea that we are being enabled to police what men do with their social time and police the way that they engage with each other is really insulting to a lot of people.
And threatening.
And threatening.
Yeah.
But just very quickly, we don't have a problem with applying those same policing methods to women and to the way that women drink and to the perceived harm that comes to women when they drink. The answer is always to say, well, you should modify.
So, yeah, and you were talking before about, in relation to that, if a woman who is pregnant has a glass of wine or two, instant judgment is made about her character.
She shouldn't be allowed to have a child. Should have it taken away from her, but not by abortion. She's not allowed to make that choice.
So there's your double standard. So Wendy, I'm really interested in the sort of the opportunity that might present itself about what Clementine's saying. With drink driving, for instance, the cultural shift is significant. And I think most people who get behind the wheel now, and we've seen the reduction in deaths over the last 20 or 30 years, is significant, though it could be better. But there is a very clear understanding of consequence when people drive when they drink now. There's no excuse for 95% of the population who should know what the consequence is if they do that. Can we get to a similar place in relation to alcohol and family violence? And if so, what would be the path? It'd be a long road, but can it be done?
Well, I think the holding people and perpetrators accountable for violence, it's not acceptable in any form. So holding them accountable for that. As to, I suppose, the factors that are present when that occurs, whether it's alcohol or some other factor that's they say is contributing to that, is not an excuse for the behaviour. And whilst it's important in any responses, there's the charging and the criminal processes that apply when there are crimes committed. There's putting in place protection for those that are actually affected by violence. But there's equally, and the Royal Commission talks to some of these issues, there's some merit, the core control and the issue which is about to deal with that. I think there are some recommendations from the Royal Commission that talk to some of these issues.
Can you tell us about some of those recommendations that might impact on
your members?
So in the
context, I think, of dealing with this, there's talk about making sure that there are drug and alcohol services that are working and responding with specialised family violence services, so assessing the needs of all parties within that family and putting in place supports to actually help to prevent reoccurrence, as well as holding perpetrators accountable. There's a need for dialogue for police to refer into those pathways, and we do that now in certain circumstances in the uptake of that, and not just about men's behaviour change programs, that and whatever the presenting factors are. And there's also discussion about understanding, for a more sophisticated discussion about the harm of family violence and alcohol, and feeding that into some of the Licensing Act reforms and discussions.
Angela, I'll get you to respond in a moment, but I do want to know from you, Wendy, you were at the forefront of a cultural change within Victoria Police to dealing with this issue 13 or 14 years ago. And I think that, in essence, what we're talking about is going to require cultural change across a whole number of institutions to have a real impact here. So tell us about what was undertaken and what sort of success you've had.
The pivotal practice so that helped refer to any other crime, investigating, charging and support services for those that are affected by the behaviour. So from 2004 up until 2014, we've seen significant change in our practice. So over 136% increase in reporting rates to police of family violence, which is quite significant. Over an 800% increase in the incidents where we lay criminal charges, and equally responses to breaches of orders and other practices within policing, and treating this as a very serious issue. It's talked about through our whole organisation. It's part of our, I suppose, strategic focus, and there's a whole range and raft of recommendations and other work that we're doing organisationally to improve our practice. Now, the Royal Commission identifies inconsistencies in some of our practice still, some cultural issues still, and some training that's still required with our members, and a raft of other recommendations. But we have come a long way from where we were in 2001, where this was treated as if, by many in the police force, as if this was a private matter and not something the police should intervene in. We absolutely intervene, we take action, and we make sure that we're referring people into support pathways to help them to recover from the effect of family violence.
Angela, you were going to respond before.
Well, I just wanted to, well, first of all, I want to pay my respect to the police force. I think there's been a tremendous improvement in the way in which they respond to victims of violence, and I take my hat off to them because, you know, the enormous increase we've seen in reporting is really a lot to do with trust and the change of trust. But when you're talking about the individual perpetrator, I actually want to come back to that idea about alcohol and sport and say that from a public health point of view, what we look at is not just the individual. You know, let's talk about the role of the alcohol industry and the role of the kinds of controls that we could, if we could involve the alcohol industry in this conversation, and we could actually make them more accountable. I have, for example, and my husband's going to smile, we used to go to our son's football matches. Now, what happens is the industry is funds some clubs. They certainly fund a slab of beer to Best on Ground. If you look at the degree to which alcohol is promoted at sports to young men, you know, we actually need to look at not just the individual's responsibility, but also the industry's responsibility, and then, dare I say it, the government's responsibility to actually have some engage with the industry about the degree of harm that it's causing and the cost. I mean, if we were actually to look at the cost of alcohol-related domestic violence on courts, on health services, on ambulances, on police force, if you reduce that, surely there's a persuasive argument that you're actually going to not only reduce harm but also reduce cost. But I think we do need to talk about the industry and about government's role.
Well, Anne-Marie, I'll come to you on that. Governments can become dependent and codependent on industries that deliver big revenue streams. And there's no doubt that taxes on alcohol deliver huge revenue streams. Easy money for governments who are otherwise loath to levy taxes in volatile political environments. So is it your feeling that governments are reluctant to confront the alcohol lobby in the way that Angela's suggesting because it might cause them more pain than they're prepared to wear?
I mean, in some senses, it should be win-win because they increase, if they increase the taxes, they get more revenue. The harms should come down for a whole range of reasons, whether it be not just family violence related reasons, but car crashes and health costs, a whole range of things will.
It's a false economy. It's absolutely. I think all of us up here accept that not doing anything about it is a false economy because the cost is enormous. But that front end loading of the revenue arriving and being used to offset taking money out of people's pockets through income tax, for instance, is an easy win for a government on a 3-year election cycle that just wants to get stuff done and worry about everything in the background later. How do we change that?
Well, I mean, I'm happy to
Poor Anne-Marie.
I'm just wondering. I think it's a really important question because
it is a really important
the taxes and make it more expensive because then people drink less and it costs more.
So how did it work when... this is an analogy that I use sometimes when I speak to groups about domestic violence, is that, and this idea that somehow we can't change it, we can't change people's attitudes, it's just part of human nature. Humans are so malleable and really easy to condition if you give them the right motivations. In I think it was 1996, they banned smoking in restaurants. And at the time, everyone said, you can't take smoking out of restaurants. People won't go out to eat anymore. And of course, people still go out to eat. And
horrified at the idea of smoking in a restaurant now, wouldn't we? Absolutely.
But then about 10 years later, when they, that experiment had proved a success, and then they said, right, well, we're going to take smoking out of pubs now because that's also a health issue. And people were like, well, you've already taken it from our restaurants. You definitely cannot take cigarettes and smoking out of pubs. People will not go out to drink anymore. And of course, people still go out to drink. And as you said, I think that if you lit up a cigarette in a restaurant or a pub now, people would look at you with horror. But we're inside.
And can I also say, it used to be, I don't know who remember, the way in which the tobacco industry used to advertise it was deeply gendered. And if you think about the role of the alcohol industry in promoting alcohol and the kinds of messages that it promotes, and you look at the gendered nature of that, the industry has really got to come to terms with the degree to which it not only contributes to harms to women from its gender stereotyping, but also the promotion of alcohol and the harms it does in the home. So I think we have to really start to have a stronger dialogue with industry about its attitude to gender and its attitude to promoting it to men and masculinity, because that's part of the problem that we face in trying to reduce alcohol-related domestic violence.
Well, I'll give you
family
the
violence.
libertarian point of view. I love a beer. I
love a glass of wine.
Never been involved in domestic violence. I don't want someone telling me how much I can drink and how much I need to pay for it because somebody else can't handle their drink. How do you change the dynamic of that argument?
Well, that's the big challenge, isn't it? Because people, even people who don't identify as libertarians, will use the libertarian argument. And I mean, I would be tempted to say it as well. I don't do this, and you can't take my wine away from me.
But I don't think it's about taking it away.
But that's what you have to change. You have to change the
Yes.
understanding around that. That's what I'm saying. You know,
Yes.
that it's working with communities. I mean, I have little faith about the idea of working with corporations because I don't think that they care about communities.
No, they don't, but the tobacco industry's changed dramatically.
Still exists.
Yeah, it's just it's gone to low and middle income countries. I know that's a deep problem.
But I think it's about working with communities to really hammer home the importance and the impact of this and say it's not about having someone take something away from you. It's about working cohesively as a society together.
Is it also about having people invest in their own futures? And what I mean by that is if somebody doesn't believe or lives, and you wrote about this a bit, Anne-Marie, if you're living in a circumstance of intergenerational deprivation and poverty and unemployment and the only model that you have in your life is one of dealing with relationships through violence and confrontation, how do you motivate anyone to change unless they can see a future that is plausible for them? And that intergenerational problem, which we see in some of our communities, is very... I mean, I grew up in an environment similar to that. Two or three generations of my family, had problems with alcohol, in and out of jail, all of that sort of stuff. It's not easy to break, and you've got to give people, do you not, a pathway out of there, a reason to believe. It's not as easy as simply telling them they shouldn't.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why if you can kind of edge people by making things a bit more expensive, by making it a little bit less available, then maybe people will drink one less. I mean, once you've had one or two...
Can I just stop you there? I'll give you an example how that doesn't work, okay? I'll give you an example and you can respond. So where I grew up in Broadmeadows, it's a socially engineered environment, and Wendy will tell you this, there are no pubs from about Pascoe Vale all the way through. There might be one in Roxburgh Park now, there might be one in West Meadows, but the idea of that Housing Commission estate, when it was established in the 1950s, was don't build a pub there because the working men, particularly there, will go there and get drunk. And so what did my dad and his brothers do? They caught the train to Pascoe Vale. The Pascoe Vale Hotel is directly across the road from the railway station, got pissed there and came home. It didn't change anything. So my point being that price point and the cost of things and trying to engineer that change isn't going to happen unless there's a fundamental shift up here. And that to me
I think we need sort of interventions at a whole range of levels. We do need perhaps to make getting intoxicated and changing, feeling that becoming disinhibited enough to switch and no longer follow the social norms that you would usually follow if you weren't drinking. If you could change those attitudes, if you can make it a little bit harder I still think it would, in some places you can change, you could diminish the number of, or you can have alcohol bans. They can be self-imposed by Indigenous communities, and they see huge decreases in their levels of family violence and child abuse and neglect. So you can make changes, and you can also see, in the US, there was a study that decreased the per capita consumption and decreased per capita consumption and there was a decrease in child homicide. So there are a whole range of ways where I think it does, maybe it doesn't work at an individual level, but at a population level, it should. it should work. And I mean, we do need to evaluate whether it works. We need to work at that lower level. We need to target a whole range of AOD services and see whether they're making sure that they're not just treating the person who's there. They just need to look at the family and the kids, not that they're paid necessarily in the Victorian system currently to see other family members. They're mostly just paid to see the person, the client that comes there with them. So you need to sort of work at that at the primary level. You also need to provide single parent pensions and do a whole range of things. Then you target the at-risk groups, and in the most serious groups, yes, you provide crisis services and you make sure that there are AOD services for those that need it.
Can I
Wendy?
talk to the issue that you're also raising? And it's not so much about the alcohol consumption, it's about if there's no model for you to actually understand what is a respectful relationship, then how can you actually take that into your life journey? So I think the respectful relationships that's being embedded into the school environment, where most children will go, is an opportunity to start to give those that don't know and haven't had that modelling and don't have that experience an opportunity to understand what a respectful relationship looks like. So we need to have those early intervention and primary prevention programs to actually help with the issues that you're talking about. Because if it hasn't been modelled, you don't live in a family where that's something that's the norm. You actually need somewhere that can help you to understand what is an appropriate relationship and what is appropriate behaviour.
Angela?
Well, I was going to take up your particular story, because that sounds to me like a very dependent drinker. And I think what the evidence that when we looked at, Ingrid and I and another colleague reviewed all the evidence, what it looked as if is that we actually don't know what particular types of interventions affect what particular kinds of drinkers and then what particular type of perpetrators. So, for example, a dependent drinker, yes, probably, is going to find wherever they can get it. But if you actually reduce the price, for example, young people who are binge drinkers might actually not be able to afford to get as pissed as they would if it was more expensive. So that might be one. We actually, there's so much we don't know, and we haven't had a chance to study to find out what are the interventions like price or like density. I mean, you're quite right. For dependent drinkers, in any area where there's a concentration or where there's a reduction of outlets, they'll just go somewhere else where they can find it. And the same in the Indigenous community. But the Aboriginal communities actually, you know, there's kind of multiple issues that need addressing. So I think we actually need to do a great deal more subtle thinking about and finding out and asking and engaging with people and with communities as what's going to work for what populations, and we don't know.
One of the things that popped up when we were having a conversation, I think a number of you mentioned, was that the industry's getting smarter as well. And I think, Angela, you mentioned, and Anne-Marie, and I think Wendy might have mentioned this as well, that the appearance of major outlets, cheap beer barns in terms of retail take-home grog are popping up now, a bit like poker machine venues did in lower socio-economic areas, and making it easier and cheaper for people to purchase grog. And therefore, you know, ipso facto, the incidence of family violence is going to be more extreme there because it's easy to get. What have you seen of that? I guess, Wendy, or do you want to address that, or is it an issue that you can talk to, or
Anne-Marie?
Anne-Marie?
Talk about Michael's outlet
Yeah,
study?
well, I think more than 80% of alcohol, or around 80% of alcohol is drunk at home nowadays. So most drinking is not done in pubs, and there aren't any responsible service practices. You can't control what's happening in private spaces. And anyway, but back to your question, which was the...
Are you seeing a pattern of these things?
Michael's work, yeah. So Michael
Michael's
Livingston has looked at the relationship between family violence and outlet density. And you can see that, particularly that in lower socioeconomic areas and in areas of higher, you know, where there are more pubs per person, you do see increased levels of violence across Victoria. So, and those sorts of studies have been echoed in the US and other parts of Australia as well.
And there was a small bit of evidence to show that if you actually, I think, reduced that density, you could get a per capita drop. But we don't, I mean, I think we haven't got sufficient evidence here, and it would be a really nice thing to try out and see whether it would make any difference to the kinds of, you know, we would have to talk to Wendy about looking at her stats.
Wendy?
So there was a recent incident where there was I suppose, an attempt to try and stop a packaged liquor outlet in the Cranbourne area where there was an attempt by the council and also by the police.
Did that have community support, can I ask?
I think so, but partly, but it was unsuccessful, and certainly there's not going to be an appeal. But I know, and the reason and part of the rationale for that, I suppose, the attempt at trying to stop that outlet getting its permit was because of the incidents of family violence that actually happen and occur in that area. And it's not the highest. It's got high numbers in total numbers. It's not the highest. I suppose, local government area for family violence per 100,000, but it certainly has very high incidence. That attempt was unsuccessful, and I think family violence incidents alone is not going to, and the number of incidents in a particular location is not going to be sufficient to actually stop permits. But I think it's part of a discussion that needs to be had about that, the correlation and whether or not, and how we manage that from a planning perspective.
In Western Australia, you have to prove, the onus of proof is on the fact that it won't create more harm by adding that licence. Whereas
So that onus is on the retailer?
Yes, that they won't, whereas here you have to prove that it will. So it's very difficult to change, to have an effect on the licensing process in Victoria.
Wendy, it's also important to know that we talked about it being in more troubled socio-economic areas, but we're not suggesting at any point that family violence is restricted to any one cohort of people, are we?
That's right, it has no bounds. Geographically, it happens in all parts of the state. It happens in all types and shapes of families. It knows no bounds, and it's not about socio-economic status. It's about a whole range of other factors, and as I say, causal factors are predominantly and fundamentally it's about power and control, but gender inequality is the core driver.
Yeah, that's the part that I'm most interested in is, again, maybe I'm just being very cynical, but the respectful relationships that are being taught in schools is one thing. The behaviour that I see being executed against young girls, especially in online spaces where, I mean, I'm pretty au fait with online spaces, but people 15 years younger than me, they're digital natives, they've grown up with that. That is every bit as real to them as the offline world. Of course, it's always used as an excuse to say, well, it's just online, what happens online isn't real. But the gendered abuse that I see occurring in online spaces, in gang kind of attacks against young women, even just to the point of if there's any perception that young women might be congregating together to the University of Newcastle recently, some women there sent me some images that had been, comments that had just been flooded on a feminist book group event that they were starting. And it was just the level of hostility was shocking even to me, who sees it all the time. So I feel like that is such an important part of this conversation, is that even prior to the concept of violence within the family, or what we understand to be domestic violence, there's a lot of violence occurring out there and a lot of patterns being instilled, as far as I see it, that is being kind of ignored in this conversation. And as we talked about before, the again, that idea of policing the way that particular groups of people use alcohol while allowing free rein to others. The sexual violence that young women especially experience at the hands of young men is quite often will be traced back to what the young woman did to provoke it. And if she was drinking, that is a huge factor that's used against her. Well, she shouldn't, and the public response is always, she shouldn't be drinking. Girls, you need to not drink so much. Girls, you need to do this, that, or the other. Don't go out and drink with strange men, etc., etc., etc. The response is never to try and limit the way that young men behave or the alcohol consumption that they participate in. In fact, it's often used, as far as I can see, as a way to excuse that behaviour. As Mitchell Pearce, that incident that involved him simulating sex with a woman's dog after forcing himself on her, like trying to kiss her. It was funny that the response after that was all about how horrifying it was that he'd committed this simulated act against a dog, but no one said anything about the fact that he'd forced his mouth on her mouth. He was just drunk, he's just having a laugh.
Or the other one was that he had a problem with alcohol.
He had a problem with alcohol.
He had to go and rehab, but there was no discussion about his behaviour.
Or how these things might be. It's all very well and good to have that caught on camera so that he has to answer to it in a public way, because that's the way that he can mitigate blame against his sports team. But that's not actually a solution, and no one's talking about the attitudes that are being perpetrated against young women and the violence that's being perpetrated against young women as a result not just of alcohol consumption, maybe escalated by alcohol consumption, but as a result of this extra wave of gendered inequality and gendered violence that's like continuing unabated out there in a really toxic way.
You don't sound like very optimistic that there's a way forward
not
here.
tonight.
And that's okay. Does anyone here feel there is?
I feel we have the most amazing opportunity we've had, thanks to the Royal Commission, to Rosie Batty's indefatigable work to try and bring this attention. And that, in this country we have national and state level policies, commitments and funds and resources given to actually trying to prevent and reduce domestic violence or family violence or partner violence or whatever one wants to call it. And at the same time, a recognition that alcohol causes significant harm and is involved with making this issue more severe. So if we can't do anything now with the governments that we have, with the commitments that we have, we actually have to do it now. This is a time to be seized. And maybe I'm a Pollyanna. I do think that there's things we can do. And I think there's things we can do at a young age, but we have to be doing it, this is a very complex issue. We can't just do it at the individual level, at the couple level, at the community level, at the social level. We have to be doing it all at once and with everything. Because there are different kinds of violence, there's different kinds of communities and different kinds of men, different kinds of drinking. And we actually need to test and work out what we can do at each stage. But I think I believe, and I believe my colleagues believe, we should be starting with young people, and we should be starting with changing the attitudes to drinking and responsibility, and we know we can do that. So I actually think we need to be testing and trying all these things, whether it's, taxation or outlets or we have to have the justice system behind us, and we do. We have to have governments committed to the issue, and we do. We have to have significant resources directed to the issue, and we do. We have no excuse not to do something about this issue now.
It's whether or not you have the social will of the people, though. Yeah. You can have all of those things.
That's why the conversation, congratulations, Trobe, we're having a conversation. It's a start. It's a start.
Wendy, can I just ask from your perspective, when you've seen change from people who go through the system, who might face the judicial system because of their behaviour, where's it come from?
So it's fundamentally about taking personal responsibility and acknowledging the behaviour and then wanting to do something about that. And not everybody will. Many will actually move on to different relationships and then perpetrate in those relationships. But those that generally take personal responsibility and want to affect change and actually do the work that's required to affect that change
but it does happen,
are the ones that are successful. Absolutely, some do. Having said that, I agree with Clementine. I think the biggest issue for us, this is not just a policing issue. You can have and you need to have a really responsive justice system and police system. You equally need to have the prevention programs that are occurring, but you actually need community will to change. This is a community issue. It's not just an agency issue. It actually needs the whole of community to actually want to do something about this. And some of the indicators and some of the research is saying that the community attitudes to this are in fact declining as opposed to improving. So there needs to be continued discourse around this issue.
Is it possible to change people's attitudes towards alcohol, Anne-Marie, in your...
Well, I think people's drinking patterns have changed a lot in the last century. I think we're starting to see an increase in abstinence among young people. There's a whole range of different movements about Dry July and Hello Sunday Morning that kind of make it more acceptable for people to say, yeah, I'm not drinking this month. So I think there's some kind of acknowledgement that it might not be, that might be for health reasons. It might be because they don't know how to. They know that they have the potential to lose a little bit of the control that they would have if they weren't drinking. So, on the other hand, women's drinking has increased a lot, and I've enjoyed some of that, in the 80s, and I, enjoyed drinking like a man and having a great time, but. Where am I going with this? I don't know.
Careful. Tell us more, Anne-Marie. Tell us about the 80s.
No. No,
That could be a whole forum on its own.
But with that has come, responsibilities and consequences, and yeah, I don't want to laden any more responsibilities on women because we have enough. But look, it isn't easy to parent. It isn't easy to you can't. It does decrease your your coordination. Eventually, you become unconscious. I mean, you can't do many. You can't drink and parent very well. Whatever sex you are, whatever gender you are, it doesn't. It doesn't
make you better at much, does it?
No.
Can I just point out that the Foundation for Alcohol Research and Education does community attitude surveys very, very frequently, and they've only just released a new report which actually shows that people's attitudes and tolerance to alcohol and alcohol-related crime and harm has changed. Now, there's the fact that attitudes to and tolerance of drinking and drinking harms is shifting. At the same time, the federal government and Vic Health, to their credit, have done national, random population studies of attitudes to family violence, and they have also seen a shift in attitudes. Previously, nobody in the community would actually think that domestic violence was anything other than physical. Now they actually understand a great deal more, and if you ask people, if when the attitude surveys were done, they would say, actually, no, it's sexual and it's emotional and it's financial. People get that now. What they don't get yet is why women don't go, because, if it was happening to me, I'd go. So, but it does demonstrate that you can take the community. If you start having these conversations, and particularly if the media start having these conversations and saying, actually, this is not acceptable, it's not tolerable, why are we tolerating alcohol-related violence in the home? If you start a conversation, you can change people's attitudes. People aren't stupid. They just need to have their attention brought to the problem. And then I reckon we can actually get them on board and get some change. I think we can do it.
Okay, we're just about to take some questions, but because you're such a pessimist on this, if I could give you the magic wand...
I actually just would like to say that I agree with a lot of what Angela's saying. I think that I would like to believe that as a community we can do it.
Well, if I can give you the magic wand, and you could change one thing immediately, whatever that is to make a difference in this situation, what would it be?
I wish you'd have briefed me on that question beforehand so I could have a think about it.
Speak from the heart. What would it be?
Well, I think that we need to have. There needs to be a lot more political and community will in Australia to address the deeply embedded issues of not just of gender oppression or gender inequality, but gendered stereotypes, jokes, casual sexism. That the casual sexism is not, it's not something that just happens like humorously on the side while all of this really terrible stuff is happening over here. That is the base foundation for violence against women to be perpetrated. It's like if you think about violence against women as being a structural building as opposed to just a kind of like shadowy mist where things happen randomly here and there. The worst kind of expressions of violence against women happen on that top floor, and that's where you have, brutal sexual assaults and intimate partner homicides, etc., etc. You can't get up to that top floor unless you go through every other level first. And at the bottom level is the casual sexism, the stereotypes, the things that are just said as jokes and girls are told to, lighten up and laugh at it. Don't, have a sense of humour about it. Don't get your knickers in a knot, etc., etc. All of that stuff makes it so much easier for the people who want to progress to the next levels or who are inclined to progress to the next levels to be able to do so.
It validates it.
Yeah, and it needs to, I think we need to get to the point where, like with the smoking analogy, where all of a sudden it becomes the fact that you would tell a casually sexist joke as if it was something funny would be something that instead of people either laughing at as if it's hilarious or not saying anything about because they feel a bit uncomfortable to challenge it, would suddenly be, it would be like the strangest, most horrible, disgusting thing that you could do is to light a cigarette up in a restaurant now. That's how people would react to that stuff, because that would make it so much more difficult for really horrific expressions of violence against women to occur. And plus, without all of that casual sexism at the bottom, it would make being alive a lot more pleasant experience for women.
That point, it's our turn to throw it open to you. We've got a couple of microphones around the building. I think there's one on either side. So if you have a question for any of our panellists, and I hope you do after that conversation, stick your hand in the air, grab the microphone, introduce yourself, and ask away. I think we'll start with the woman here who's got a hand in the air. Yep. The white dress.
You're talking about how it's easy to get programs into the youth because they haven't been influenced yet. But I went to a pretty good school. We had all the alcohol problems. We had all the talks about all of it. And still you just see boys and girls laugh at them, go ha ha ha, and go out on the weekend and get drunk. So if we already have all these programs, what are you going to do on top of that to actually try and change the problem?
You guys are the researchers, not me.
I just think we've got an enormous amount of work to do. You're quite right. There are some of those programs there and in some schools. But you actually need, I think, for young people to change young people's attitudes. I think you've got to actually have you've got to not only work in schools, but I think you've got to get the industry, the people who are influencing young people to drink and how they do that. We've got to work a great deal better at that level as well. At the same time, I think we've got to, I think for anything that addresses the issue of violence against women and exploitation of women and children, you've got to have the legal system in place, you've got to have everything in place. And I think that we've got a lot of things in place already around policing and around, not everything, we've still got intervention order breaches to deal with, but we actually have a lot in place, and I do think that if we can gauge the government is already halfway there, and the industry is the missing link here. I think we have to engage with how they advertise alcohol to young people in schools, in sporting clubs, wherever they go. You go on a bus, on a tram, and you see some slinky woman with just an appallingly sexist advertising. And it's doing a lot of things. It's working on women's sense of self. And then, if you're feeling a little bit low, you can reach for a very nice inexpensive drink to make yourself feel better. So I think we have an enormous amount of work to do, and I don't think it's easy at all. I hope I don't give that impression, but I do think it's possible.
I wonder how much of it is. I'm just offering this as a possible topic, not saying that this is exactly what we should do, but modelling, not trying to prevent drinking or stopping drinking or even demonising drinking, but modelling responsible drinking to young people. My parents drank, not to excess, but drinking and frivolity was certainly something that we saw in our house. And then when I was a teenager, my parents knew she's going to go to parties and she will drink. That is a reality. And rather than creating an environment where I had to hide any of that from them, my dad, before a party, would take me to the bottle shop and he would buy me, it was 1996, so he'd buy me a 6-pack of lemon ruskies, and he would put it...
Obviously wasn't concerned about your teeth.
It's going to sound so daunting, but he'd put it in a little cooler box for me, and he would say, drive me to the party, and he'd say, that's your alcohol, don't drink any more of that, which, of course, I drank more than that. But he also said to me, at any time of the night, you can call me, I will expect your call, and I will come and pick you up, because he never wanted me to get into a car with someone who'd been drinking. And I would say that I probably do drink a lot more than other people. I don't think I have a drinking problem, but I suppose lots of people say that. But I also don't think that, I've never felt like... There's a point at which I'm drinking where I'm like, okay, that's enough for me now, and I've got to stop. I've never been able to keep going and keep going. I've never been violent while drinking. And I wonder how much of that has been influenced by the idea of having a space within which I was allowed to experiment with alcohol with the supervision of adults and with the condonement of adults, where I knew that I wasn't going to get into trouble for it. So I don't know whether or not working with ideas like that, it's kind of problematic for a lot of people because they think that it encourages drinking at a young age. But kids are drinking anyway, and even if you raise prices of alcohol, they will find alternatives. There were a girl who I went to university with who used to tell stories about they couldn't get access to alcohol, so they'd spray Impulse into the lid and drink that. I don't think that it would have gotten them drunk, but it could have gotten them very sick. So I don't know. I think like a little bit of realism as well is maybe helpful.
So the cultural shift. So in some cultures, the introduction of alcohol at the dining table at a younger age sort of normalised the social aspect of alcohol, the social role of alcohol, rather than it being
And takes the allure out of it in terms of being something that you're getting away with.
Except that I think we have this slight delusions about the Mediterranean drinking culture. And look, it's lovely to have a glass of wine over dinner, and but what happens is if you introduce it earlier, maybe watered down alcohol. What we've done in Australia, I think, is just overlaid that. So you start a little earlier, and then you just, so on top of the Mediterranean drinking culture, you just lay the Anglo-Saxon Celtic drinking culture on top. So I think young people under 18, there's more and more people drinking, abstaining from drinking than there has ever been for in the last 10 years. So maybe they are getting the message. Maybe their attitudes and their behaviours are easier to change than, and some of the stuff around parental drinking is also showing that both males and females, as parents, when they're young parents, their drinking levels are going down. But then in older parents, they're not going down in quite the same way. So maybe it's baby boomer Gen X.
Are people under 18 choosing not to drink, though, because they're taking other drugs?
No, other drug use is also going down.
Let's get to some more questions. We'll come to the hands in the air. There's somebody at the back with a microphone in their hand. Just introduce yourself and ask.
Oh, hello. My name's Marion. I've spent a little bit of time in India just recently, and they have a terrible problem with alcohol and domestic violence, really bad. And they have gone in really, really hard. And the government has taken on the tourist industry, because you can imagine they wouldn't be too thrilled, and they have dry days. And the particular days they have dry days is called salary days. People get paid once a month. Salary day after, no alcohol. And I think, I like a drink myself, I'll say that. But I wonder if softly isn't working. What do we do? We talk about, attitudes, gradual, but still people are being, murdered, and there's still a lot of violence.
Are you advocating a form of modified prohibition?
No, not at all, because we know that doesn't work. But
actually, in the Aboriginal communities, that's exactly what the women in Halls Gap and Tennant Creek did, was to say, on the day when our cash check comes in from welfare, that's the day we want dry. We want not prohibition, but we want the pubs to close, and that's where there was demonstrated that. The rates of violence and women turning up in hospitals and refuges went down. So it's possible, but I do think there's cultural specificity, and that's why I think we actually need to be talking to people in different communities and asking them what they think would work in their community. I do think, it's horses for courses. And in the Indian community, there's such a serious level of attitudes of deeply ingrained sexism and violence. And, it's a very problematic culture when it comes to violence against women generally. And then you lay alcohol on the top of that. I think we're hoping to do some further work with the South Asian communities that we're working with currently on violence against women, and talking about alcohol, listening to what they have to say about it and what they think would work, I think is a really, really important thing to do. Because if we want to find interventions that work for certain communities, then we need to be hearing what they think is going to be is the severity of the problem and what they think would be the answer. And I think India's found one way to go.
Some more questions. We should take one from this side of the room. So,
hi, my name is Tanya, and this is a great conversation and a great topic. There is a lot of talk about prevention and how we, so to speak, groom and educate young generations, so when they are parents, they can pass the right message on their children, and the whole society will get better, and this problem will hopefully decrease. I'm just wondering if there is anything that can be done with, say, my generation or people younger than me, their parents now. Because a lot of this culture and attitude comes from the family. And of course there is a government and media and reinforcement and outlets, all those factors play a significant role. But I think in the heart of that is the attitude and climate that comes from the family background.
Yeah, so tackling how parents drink, or in particular, or any members within the family, older members of the family. When
There was
people
that
have,
ad campaign that they did with they showed the generations of how you replicate those practices by getting your son to go and get a beer from the fridge for dad, and then how
They're
that
quite
kind of
good ads, those. And you can, I agree with you that the family is the absolute, the kernel of developing better, just developing healthy responses and healthy ways to be. And I think that, if we can work with the family as a core unit, the question is how. And you again, I think you do it by community attitudes, encouraging healthy parenting. We actually, at our centre, we have a new program called Transition to Contemporary Parenting that's looking at all these interrelated problems of how do we actually support parents in this millennial era to feel comfortable that they actually have, they're able to pass on good, responsible behaviours to their kids, around screen time, as well as around alcohol, as well as around respectful relationships. What we also know is that, if a child is abused in the family or actually witnesses violence against their parents, they are more likely, a third of girls to become victims and about half of the boys to become perpetrators. But I think sometimes we forget to look at the fact that 2/3 of girls don't and 50% of boys don't then become perpetrators. And what we need to understand better is how we support those kinds of resiliencies in children. And I think those are the sorts of things that the work that we're hoping to do would answer. But I agree with you that families are critical and that intergenerational transmission. Why is it that some people grow up in abusive families and they still come out strong and they still come out okay? What can we do to strengthen that attitude and that resiliency?
I think we had some questions down to these people in the middle row here who've been keen to ask a couple of questions. So. Just pass it along when you're done.
Hi, my name's Sarah. I'm working in the sector at the moment. I've done some work in the prevention sphere, and it's just interesting for me to see how response services are just getting engaged with this prevention discussion and gender equity. Everyone's about gender equity. Everyone's sort of just getting their heads around the fact that, the root cause of intimate partner violence is, power control and gender equity and all that sort of stuff. So I guess my question is, I had about 5 questions and they all kind of melded into one confusing one. But my question is about, do they need to be 2 sort of separate campaigns? How do we bring alcohol into a prevention campaign when we've only just sort of got our heads around this idea of gender equity? And how do you bring gender equity into that alcohol campaign, if it's a national movement to reduce drinking? Do they just have to be side by side, or how do we sort of converge them to share a message? Does that make sense?
It's a great question, I reckon.
I thought it was a great question.
Yeah.
And I think that I would personally prefer to see them converge into one campaign, and I think that would be... I don't think that separating them, from my perspective, is helpful, particularly if the intention is to tackle how alcohol can lead to family violence or lead to violence against women. There was a campaign in Canada called, it wasn't specifically about alcohol, but it was called Don't Be That Guy, and it was about sexual assault. And instead of the normal kind of like horrible campaigns that you might see where it's instructing, again, women to change their behaviour, it was outlining particular incidents in which a man makes a choice to perpetrate an act of violence against a woman, and illustrating that and then saying, don't be that guy. And what Canada found after that campaign was that incidents of reported sexual assault decreased by 10%, which is huge. And there's no reason why it wouldn't be the success of the campaign and would instead be, oh, well, women are just reporting less, particularly if that level of community awareness is occurring. So for me, I feel like combining the two campaigns is essential, particularly in getting people to realise why they're connected and why it's impossible to address violence without addressing the issue of gender inequality in general.
Maybe you could say something like it's never an excuse. Nothing is an excuse. I don't know.
Well, I think that, I mean, if you're just talking about specifics, I think it's much more important to emphasise the issue of choice. You know, to not sort of say, oh, it's not an excuse, but to say it's always a choice.
I think don't be that guy. You could do your brilliant campaign with don't be that guy who's a dickhead and gets drunk and then abuses his partner. Sorry.
In a language
I've got
everyone
my vice
understands.
chancellor here. I better be careful. But you could see a campaign where it was actually directed toward the behaviour when you are drunk, and that you actually... I would like to see a campaign that actually does that, so it tackles that, don't be that guy, but also that actually asks others around them to take responsibility. We really want to do some work on, you know, whether they're a guardian slightly who have some responsibility of care towards younger people who take responsibility if they're drunk and say, I'm sorry, I'm not allowing you to go home tonight, you're going to sleep here because I'm worried about, you know, the safety of your girlfriend. Or, you know, another bloke in the group who says the same thing. Look, mate, I think you're just a little bit past it, and I'm a bit worried that you're going to go home and knock up your missus. So let's do something else. I mean, it's quite possible to do that.
So just on that issue, so I think that's right, and it's important to give those messages around the gender inequality, as well as if alcohol's an issue for that particular person that exercises power and control and abuse. But the risk in combining the two is that only the people that drink and then perpetrate violence will identify with that. It actually means that those that perpetrate violence and who don't drink or who have other behaviours might actually disengage from that. So you need to be careful around how you deal with it.
As part of a campaign.
Yeah. So you need to nuance it around that, because it's not the whole thing. It's part of the issue, but there's many other people that alcohol is not the problem for them and their offending behaviour, and we need to make sure that any campaigns we do, people can identify and then start to take some personal responsibility.
And I think also, from my experience in a sports club, it's reorienting the gender makeup of the football club I was involved in, involving women at board level. I'm involved with a football club that Peter Searle, who's now the assistant coach of the St Kilda Football Club, she was the defensive coach in our team. And I think that came through a whole range of different changes within the football club that made that very normal. And the boys in that team, it's a fairly high-grade amateur football, she's regarded as the best defensive coach they've had. And it had nothing to do with her gender in the end, because she was just damn good at her job, and hence she'll probably be the first professional football coach of a standalone AFL team. But because the makeup of the club had changed with the normalisation of the roles of women in that club on an equal basis at all levels of the club, it felt very much like your gender was not an issue within all tiers of that football club. And I think as a consequence, the young men in that club are much better people for that. So it's being brave at an institutional level to make those decisions, you know, whether it takes quotas on boards or whatever it does, to actually change the genetic makeup in that sense of those institutions, which will drive a change that happens of its own because people have a better understanding of that gender equity.
Yeah, I think it's imperative that you see not just women, but see people of colour, like a full diverse range of people participating in every level of society. Not only obviously because of the skills and experience that can be brought to those things, but currently the best people to do any job in the society that we live in right now is a white man. And I'm saying that very specifically because the way that those organisations are structured is to reward the experiences of middle-class white men in particular who help and support each other into those roles. To change public thinking around that and think, well, you know, we live in this incredibly diverse community, it only makes sense that the positions of power and leadership and direction and guidance that kind of influence all of the things that we participate in, be equally reflective of that diversity, is somewhere that I feel like we can move towards. I do have optimism about that.
I was going to say, think of the extraordinary change we've seen towards gay people, towards trans, in gender broadly speaking. There's been an amazing sea change of attitude amongst communities and amongst institutions.
We can get there. It's just a matter of continuing to, force the issue. You know, so that you mentioned football, the footy show. I don't really watch football, sorry, but the footy show recently appointed a woman to be on the panel. I think to replace Gary Lyon. Now, the issue of Gary Lyon cutting his mate's lunch is a whole other separate one of sexism in sport. But the response from a lot of the people who are obviously fans of that show to this appointment of one woman was still really horrifying in terms of how deeply entrenched sexist ideas were, you know, and the idea of merit. Oh, she's only been given this job because bloody feminism has to go and take everything away from us. I saw an ad for a new TV show that's coming out in America soon about a black female baseball player who plays in a men's team, and all of the comments on the video were about how, this is just bloody society now just has to take everything and make it female. So I think we still have a long way to go, but we won't get there unless we actually do force the issue.
Have we got time for a couple more questions? I think there was, sorry, yeah.
I'm Josette. I work with Eastern Health in a role that's preventing violence against women in the Yarra Valley and also driving gender equity in the organisation at the moment. And I just felt that I needed to make this comment today because I've worked in this sector for about 15 years, and I've worked with towns like Katherine in the Northern Territory, which are like the redneck capital of Australia, consume about 5 times as much per capita alcohol than other parts of the nation. And when I worked with them, I was only a young practitioner, and I was completely shocked at the depth of understanding and willingness of that community to talk about its alcohol issues and the link that it was ready to make to violence and family violence. And even today, in the last few months, the work that I've been doing with Hillsville and with the Yarra Valley Football League, I've been asked by seniors within the club who've said, we want you to keep working with us around gender equity, and we want you to talk to us about alcohol. So I think there's a real willingness in the community that we need to be brave and just keep making the link, keep asking the questions.
Can I ask what changes they've made at that level, say for instance in those clubs, to try to address that in a practical sense?
Well, I think that so Brandon Murphy, for example, who was our Citizen of the Year, he talked about the cultural change of when he was in a footy club in Hillsville, and you know, even as a kid, you could walk up to the counter and grab a beer, and how that doesn't happen nowadays. And even though there's been a lot of high-profile incidences in the AFL, we're not hearing about the deep work that they're trying to do within the AFL. And I've been impressed by the investments that they're making to change culture and produce, you know, better men within the club. So there's a story that we're not telling, which is about how much action's already happened and people's willingness. I think as communities collectively, if we actually can share the story of what's happening and what's contributing to our well-being, we'll take the necessary steps. You know, we've got enormous capacity in Australia. I think we just have to keep going.
Yeah.
I think that the organisers of this event need to get your details afterwards, so and
then we'll pay you.
Have you on for the next forum like this, so that you can bring your experience.
Yeah,
I think we've got time for a couple more questions. If we've got this gentleman in the middle here, the Benny, and then we'll go to the back.
Issue lies in why people drink. Do you think it's about mental health, or is it more so about Australian culture surrounding drinking?
Oh, that's a forum on its own, isn't it? Why people drink the way
Why
they
do people drink? I think they drink for a lot of reasons. I mean, for some people they're trying to self-medicate. I think most people drink because it is enjoyable and it does make them relax. Perhaps it's more problematic if you are trying to fill a gap or hide something. But I don't know what. Sometimes I sort of think, Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't really need to drink, but I still do, and I do enjoy it. But I mean, I'd probably enjoy my life just as much without it. But at the same time, it's become a habit.
Yeah, I think that there are lots of reasons why people drink. I mean, speaking from personal experience, I drink partly for enjoyment and partly because it's, you know, a way to self-medicate anxiety in the short term that doesn't actually help very much the next day. But also, I think that in Australian culture in particular, it's made very difficult to not drink. And it's sort of like a combination of the two, really.
Yeah, we probably missed that fact that there is a lot of, whilst we're talking about it, a choice to drink, we do have the choice to drink or not drink, but there's a lot of pressure on people to drink and to shout rounds. And
Anne-Marie, you spoke about the 80s. I think that there are more social spaces now where it's permissible not to drink than there used to be. There was previously, if you went to a gig or to a party, you know, the principal aim of the experience was to get pissed. And I don't think that that's necessarily always the case anymore. So maybe we're getting better at that.
There can be some discomfort in social groups, though, when one person says... That's why things like Dry July and October and what's the February one? Febfast. That's why they work so well, because they're done with a purpose. People can be a part of a community. Yeah, they have permission to do it.
And P plates. I mean, it's 3 years no drinking. So there's a lot of time when you're young, at least some of the time, you have to make that choice.
But if you don't have those excuses to do it in certain social groups, and you turn up and you announce, "I'm not drinking tonight," there can be a lot of it's a judgment, you know, that your choice to not drink is judging me for drinking, and that's something I'm going to make you feel bad about.
There's also the opportunities. I know that on university campuses there are certain. I mean, the alcohol industry will come along and say, "Okay, you throw a party, we'll bring you free grog." Now, so it's about. Particularly, I think, when you're young, and I'm reflecting a little way back to when I was young, and at university, and you are uncertain, you know, about everything, about who you are, about where you're going, about your relationships, and so drinking relaxes you and it disinhibits you, and it's nice. But nowadays, it seems to me there's so many more opportunities to drink that the industry is providing to me unnecessarily, making it more available in sports clubs on university campuses. That, you know, there are different ways that we could make those choices a little less easy, whilst understanding that people like to drink and it does make them, relaxed. It's just the problem with it, and particularly in sporting clubs or in places where young people go, is that you start that level of the people who have the potential to become dependent drinkers. It actually starts earlier, and that's an increasing problem. And I think in Australia we've got that in general. We've got that problem to face about the drinking culture and the early drinking culture and the rates of binge drinking, although they're sort of sliding or stabilising or going down. But yeah,
I think we've got time for just one more question because we have hit our buzzer time.
Hi, my name's Marita. I work in the front line as well, responding to children and women and families in domestic violence and men as well. And one thing I've noticed, and I work in a special family violence role, so part of my role is to respond to frontline and also to help with the education of other workers. And one thing I've really noticed in my own personal life and also the workplace is about the inherent sexism in life, in sort of society, and how this sort of, you know, like your house analogy, Clementine, about how it starts with the casual sexism and it goes the way. And that casual sexism is not to be underestimated. Women are very happy to have that conversation, but unfortunately a lot of men aren't happy to have that conversation. And my attempts to try and convince the men that I work with or I'm friends with just end up me being sort of a raging mess, and that just kind of underlies their sort of thinking that, oh, women are crazy feminists or feminists are crazy women.
It really makes a separatist community look quite appealing, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. what I would like to sort of understand, so from the host, sorry, I've forgotten your name, is to... Francis, to sort of understand, you've said before that there's a certain cohort of men that are starting to understand and acknowledge about gender inequality and acknowledge that they're in a position of privilege, and that position of privilege should be used, in my opinion, to try and even out this gender equality. How do you go about talking to your friends, talking to your mates? Because that's where it starts, to make feminism not a dirty word to men.
Well, I think that it depends. My cohort of friends, I think that conversation happens anyway. But I deal with it on the radio a lot as well. I work in the sports industry. These days I work as a sports broadcaster, and I hear a lot of that sort of attitude. And you have to be brave, and you have to confront it, and you have to talk about it, and try to make people understand that the casual comments they make about, Serena Williams or whatnot, are fundamentally and profoundly, wrong and offensive. But also, I think my experience with my football club and others is that I think it does come from a very rounded experience of life in the home. And my experience is that it comes from having role models as fathers in particular who display respect to the women in their lives and have shown through their deeds and actions and words that they live that. And I think that that's a really powerful tool in the next generation of young men that I have contact with who are coming through, who are also instilled with those values and live those values. Not always, because, young boys will fuck up, to be perfectly honest, and they'll mess up and they'll make mistakes. But fundamentally, what I see is a role modelling, and this is my experience personally as well, through other men in my family and my wider life, who gave me that model of behaviour that I probably didn't have there in my own home at the time. And it's a really powerful and instructive tool that gave you an opportunity to be something else and gave you the strength to be something else and not feel that you have to behave as one of the boys. I was never one of the boys, although I have been involved in environments where the dominant culture would suggest that you have to be. But I can work in that world, I can move in that world, but I don't lose my voice as a man who doesn't want to behave that way. It's not the easy path, but it's possible. And it comes from having a relationship with other men, both around your own age and those older than you, that have shown you the values and the rewards of that, of having really powerful, strong, rich relationships with women on a respectful level that you treasure almost above everything else. That's been my experience. That I don't see, and I do see a lot of men who see the relationship they have with women as separate and different to the relationship they have with men. Yeah. And it's a totally different dichotomy, a different language, a different set of expectations, a different almost pecking order. Whereas for me, that doesn't exist. I've never understood that. But I think for me, it was that experience of having really strong and authentic experience of how my elders in my life dealt with women. And I think that comes back to that respect and education and that being passed on generation to generation. I don't think that is the most valuable tool, in my experience, in actually making young boys into good men.
It's the difference. It's the difference between seeing the world as made up of people and women.
Yeah.
And if you're trained to communicate with. If men are trained to communicate with other men as being people, and then women are this weird, strange subspecies that they have to cajole respect or sex out of, or whatever it might be, then that inability to relate to them and the frustration, I think, that comes up from that, and this sort of sense of entitlement. I mean, entitlement really is what underpins all of it. I find it interesting, the emotional labour that women are still expected to perform to raise up good men. Oftentimes, particularly in online spaces, one of the methods and tools that women will use to try and kind of shame men into changing their behaviour is to maybe show what they've written to their mother or their girlfriend. And I can understand the thinking behind that, because the sense is that, we'll show this to a woman in your life so that she will get angry at you for the way that you're treating other women. Or they'll say things like, well, your mother must be really proud of you. I want to know why no one ever says your dad must be really proud of you for making, sarcastically for making that comment, or your dad must be really ashamed of you for the way that you treat women. There's never any kind of inclusion of fathers in that role of emotional labour that's being performed.
Well, that's what I'm saying. That's that's where the breakthrough comes.
Which is why it's so vital for fathers to be encouraged to model good behaviour towards women, and not the kind of behaviour where they are still positioning themselves as the protector or the paternalist kind of guy that gets to go in and save the woman, because that just leads to just recycling the same problems.
So we could be here for a long time, but we are going to get kicked out pretty soon. Can you give us a big round of applause to all our panellists? Clementine, Angela, Wendy, Anne-Marie, thank you for all your insight. If you go to the website, the Bold Thinking Series website, I do believe, Chris, this will be up and we'll be able to read the transcript and listen again. And if you want to get up there and involve in the conversation, #BoldLTU. And this is just the start of that conversation. Thank you for coming along tonight.